My name is Pallasmaa. I'm an interior architect from Tallinn. I'm from practical side of that profession. I have a small studio, and I know nothing about theories. I'm far from academic line, and I have practiced more or less about 20 years on that field. My relation to impact of space is result that when it's still here, the interior, then I've been successful. When it's not, then it was a failure. I also, like Hannes, I was yesterday together with my son. We didn't make this sleeping box. We discussed about SISU, and I told him that I'm one of the moderators this afternoon, and he asked me, are you able to do that? And I got a little bit panicked. And that led me to think about, why are we all here? Why are here the guests? Why are they so special that we have them here? Okay, when we think globally, we have the same moon, the same sun, the same senses. Why are they better than we are here? Okay, we have a different history, different background, but more or less we should be the same. And what came to my mind is that actually what we have been able to follow yesterday and today is the way of thinking that it seems to me that these guests we have, they are able to think differently, and I enjoy the approach to problems and the way they look things and themes they are going through. So please, we are very honored to see and to have our guests here. Please, Graeme Brooker from London, from Middlesex University.
Thank you. Gosh, round of applause before I even begin. It can only go one way, downhill. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and do this with this microphone rather than handheld. I tend to wave my hands around, so I'll try not to do that. Thank you very much, Tuna, Christian, for inviting me, and Uma. Sorry for my pronunciation of your name, which I'm determined to get right the time that I'm here. It's a real honour to come and speak here and to be part of this wonderful event, so thank you. I really appreciate it. It's my first time in Tallinn as well, so really enjoyable. I'm aware that I'm in a room where English isn't the first language, so I do have a London accent slightly, so please either ask me to slow down if I'm talking too quickly, or ask me to speed up if it's getting a bit boring. And if there's any strange London words that I throw in, which I'm prone to do, put your hand up and ask me what it means and I'll explain. I'm going to show some work as we go through, which is partly my own from publications, but also much more so of projects, interior spaces, images, some of my student work. So if I do make you fall asleep, at least you've got some nice pictures to look at. I'm from Middlesex University in London, although I can't tell you anything, but that's about to change. Maybe if you buy me some drink later, I'll tell you what that means. But my current job is working as a head of department for fashion and interiors, and it's a mixture of fashion, interiors, interior architecture, interior design, fashion textiles, fashion communication. And it's the first department in the UK to explicitly make that connection. And actually, I'm still yet to find a department across the world that's made that connection as well, explicitly. So maybe you can tell me if I haven't found that department yet. But I was very drawn to this job because of that exact interdisciplinary connection, which I find very, very interesting. And in the 2.5 years I've been there, we've had some really great conversations about fashion, body, space, constructed environments, clothing, identity. Anyway, that's not what I'm going to talk about. Just wanted to introduce myself a little bit to you. Your invite, the impact of space, really made me think. It was a nice provocation. And it kind of made me think about the impact of space on me, really, and my impact upon space. And I thought, as I always do when I get invited to these wonderful events, I always do the classic thing where I conjure up this amazing title or an interesting title, send it off and say, this is what I'm going to talk about, and then I haven't got a clue what I'm going to talk about and spend ages trying to work out what I meant by the title. So bear with me. I'm hoping to make you think a little bit about space. An introduction about me, because I'm going to be talking about some of my own work, particularly around publications that I do. So a little bit about me. I'm an educator, essentially. An academic, I suppose, although I'm not very keen on that word. It makes me sound like a disease or something, you know, like an epidemic or something. I'm a writer, practitioner, but my practice is writing, really, and teaching. So I kind of mix all of these things up, really. But really, the bottom line is I'm an advocate, I feel, for the interior and have been for many, many years. I'm not an architect. I studied interiors, both at undergraduate, postgraduate level. And that's given me, I like to think, a particular sensibility, which I then talk to my students about. And we'll talk more about that later. So your question about the impact of space, well, I kept coming back to the question of myself, is why? Why am I so interested in the interior? What is the impact upon me? Why am I so interested? Why am I an advocate? Well, this paper, this presentation is going to be a little bit about why and maybe a bit more about how I participate in this, this discipline. Hence the title, The Interior Condition, Impact and Agency. Before we get into it, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me and do some blatant plugging for the books that I write, because you all need to buy them. Because I'm a struggling author with a large family to support. Where am I coming from? Well, as I say, I've trained and been educated as an interior designer and practice as an interior designer, and I teach and advocate in this subject. And over the years, I've realised that really where I'm coming from and where it really started was that as I went through that process, I tended to sit down a lot with students or on my own when I was a student and say, where can I find out about this stuff? And I struggled really to find books about the interior that meant something to me, I have to say. And I struggled to really understand who was talking about the interior in a meaningful way. That's changed a lot now. There's many people in this room who have contributed brilliantly to that conversation. It's much easier for our students now, actually, I think, to find really good stuff about the interior, people talking about it in a substantial manner. But anyway, where I'm coming from really over the years is I've taught really very much about the interior in all of its manifestations, whether it's about space, the room, the city, urbanism. A lot of my work is about remodelling, reuse. That's really what I'm very interested in, and that's just one aspect of the interior. There are many which you're all familiar with. The notion of occupation, human occupation, inhabitation, and I use that word quite distinctly, and we'll come to that later. Susie's mentioned it already, and she, I know, like myself, are coming at it from a very particular angle. Waste is very interesting. It's something I've been doing a lot of work on recently, the idea that things become discarded and redundant, and then they become revalued again. But essentially all of my work has been very much about trying to, I suppose my own energy is about developing some form of body of work, knowledge, ideas, and just hopefully advocating for the subject, generally trying to contribute to its knowledge base. As I say, most of this, this is the blatant plug part, most of this has manifested itself in the form of books. I've just completed my 10th book, which I've just handed into a publisher about building reuse. Please buy them all. I'm going to talk about some of these as we go through, so I won't need to talk about them too much now. But essentially, many of them about the interior. These are the two most recent ones, which I'm going to talk about in this discussion. So again, I don't need to tell you too much about those currently. But as well as that, as an advocate, I am the founder and director, very proud to be the director of this group, which is called Interior Educators. Interior Educators is the subject association, the national subject association for the UK. You may or may not know, but in the UK we have approximately 65, 66 courses undergraduate with the word interior in them. There's about 10 of those that use the term interior textiles around the fashion area, which is absolutely fine. And then there's kind of 54-ish that talk about interior architecture, interior design predominantly. All of these guys are members of Interior Educators, and we meet twice a year. We hold an annual event, which you're all invited to in London every year, in Brick Lane in the East End of London, where all of our students show. What a pedagogical tool that is. I cannot begin to tell you what that's done to the state of education in the UK in terms of upping the relationships and the work that our students do. It's amazing. This year's our 7th edition, and there's going to be about 500 students there, about 38 courses, so not everybody shows, but it's quite spectacular. We conference once a year. The last one was in London at Middlesex, called The Body and Space, hence the fashion connection. Where our guys are involved in research, and we're starting to set up a journal, much in the model of Suzie's wonderful idea journal. And we've just started a new platform called Interior Educator Student, which essentially is a digital platform for all of our students to link to. So, you know, conservatively, you're talking about 4,000 students in the UK, where practices, the commercial world, connect up to it. Our students are getting information from each other. I mean, my view of it is that in 10 years' time, it will become its own university, a digital university, an open university, but, you know, that's way off down the line. But anyway, we've got a great group of people, is the point I'm making. It's a real energy. We're not aligned to any professional body in the UK. We don't connect with those guys. And essentially, we connect with others across the world. So it's an open invitation to the Tallinn associations to talk after this meeting if you'd like to connect up with our network, or we connect up with yours. The interior condition, that's a bit about me. That's where I'm coming from. The interior condition, impact and agency. What is the interior condition? What do I mean? Is it a kind of a shape, a form? Not really. When I say condition, I like to think of the condition of something as its unique features. What is it about? And in this talk, I'd like to talk about the unique features of the interior. Some of them you may agree with, some of them you may not, but I'd like to position the interior as this self-aware, reflective, and sometimes critical understanding of what this discipline is. And I'm going to touch on some of the unique features, I think, that are very particular to this discipline and are very much our territory or our ideas. At the same time, I'm fully aware that the interior is an open-ended subject, and that's really why I like it so much. It's primarily a discipline which has the capability to engender, to foster a wide variety of voices, stories, narratives about its history, about its profession, about its education, ideas about what inside and outside space is, who does it and why. Had a very interesting conversation at lunch about Bollywood superstars becoming interior designers. Bring it on. I like that. The reason I like it, and hair architects as well, we were having a nice discussion about, so I don't need those anymore, but we were talking about hairdressers being interior designers. The interior, for me, can be used to provide the spatial geography of so many ways of understanding patterns of human use and occupation. And that, to me, is why it's so fascinating. It's not closed, it's open. And that, to me, is very, very important. I'm fascinated by its unregulated, its ambiguous, and its unfixed nature. And that's why it makes it fascinating. And because of this, well, you know, the kind of negative polarity of that, the opposite, is the fact that sometimes people misunderstand it. That's all right. It's okay. I suppose the really negative is that sometimes people misalign it a little bit. They talk about it in a negative fashion. You know, it's kind of unsubstantiated. It's, well, it's decorative, isn't it? You know, etc. I remember practicing in many offices in London and Manchester, particularly in the early 90s, where I was referred to as the inferior designer. That's all right. I don't mind that. It's fine. I think that's changed actually a lot, and for many reasons, which I haven't got time to go into now. But anyway, the negative pole of this ambiguity is where people deride it and say it's kind of slippery, or it's kind of lacks substance. I'm going to sort of be a bit provocative, really. Maybe we'll start some conversations. I think that's really good, and I think that's actually the perfect condition for the interior. And I'm going to kind of try and explain a little bit why, a little bit as to why I think that is. To me, it's a thing that proves that it's relevant, it's energetic, and it gives it its dynamism. That's what makes it so fascinating. It's uncodified, it's unfixed to a certain degree. And I know, you know, practitioners in the audience after are going to shout at me and go, well, you know, you try explaining that unfixedness to a client. That's okay. You can do it. It's not codified, and that's why I think it's interesting. Now, why? Why is it interesting? Well, I don't know if you know this, I hope you do. This is Stonehenge in the UK. When the interior is at its most obscure, it's at most unsubstantiated, slippery, ill-defined, misunderstood, it's for me personally when it's at its most intriguing, and maybe for some of you as well. Like any misunderstood or uncodified object, Stonehenge, an unfixedness engenders curiosity, I think. It engenders a desire to define and to codify and to work out what it is. But like many things, such as Stonehenge, the more you try and describe it, sometimes the more it slips through your fingers. And, you know, I'm looking at a big picture here, a lovely big picture, of a monument which has existed for thousands of years, and nobody knows what it does. I like to describe this often as one of the best interior spaces in the world, because nobody sometimes quite knows always what that does. And it's that slippery quality that makes us keep coming back for more. Because when we don't know what something is fully, when it's uncodified, maybe when it's still lacks some definition, when it needs to be understood, people speculate. People want to talk about it. People keep coming back for more. They try to define it. Only recently there was a fabulous a theory about a new one about Stonehenge and about how it was. I can't remember exactly what it was now. It was something to do with it was I don't know, a Tesco or something, you know, a supermarket or something silly like that. But it was funny. The notion that people keep on trying to define, and that is what gives anything its dynamism, its energy. People just keep coming back for more. I think that's a really necessary and fundamental aspect of the interior. The curiosity that this subject engenders is of paramount importance, and it's what keeps us all interested and what makes it so dynamic. And I would go even further and say, in the last 10 years, particularly in the UK anyway, the interior has been interior research, interior teaching, and quite a lot of aspects of interior practice have been really fascinating and far more interesting than other built environment subjects, namely architecture, but also art installation as well. The interior in the UK, at least, and I hope in Europe and further afield, is really the subject. As you can see, I'm an advocate for this discipline. So anyway, if this is the case, you may not think it is, but if it's the case, then I need to sort of talk a little bit more about these conditions. What are the reasons for these conditions? Why is it slippery? It's just me who's saying it's ambiguous, or maybe a few other people as well, but why is that? Why is it important? What's the point of that? Well, I'm going to speculate on a few conditions of the interior just to kind of describe where maybe some of these sources of unfixedness and the importance of them arise from. And the three areas I'm going to talk about, one is languages, the language of the interior. The second one is reuse, which is something very close to my heart and something that I do a lot of in terms of the way I teach and write. And then the third aspect is the history of the interior, and that's a bit related to reuse. And I'm going to use some of my own work. I'm going to flash up some pictures of other people's work and even some of my students' work as well as we go along, because I tend to talk about what I teach as well. And then in the final part of this paper, depending on how I'm doing for time, I'm going to discuss the sort of impact of these ideas and also the agency as well. Who's doing them? Why and where? Let's talk about language to start with. The everyday language that we use for the interior is ambiguous. Okay? When you look up the word interior, and because I'm not really an academic. I am somebody who came to teaching very late, and also somebody who came to writing very late. I was terribly unacademic at school. Got thrown out of school, if I'm being very honest with you, for being rubbish and messing around and stuff like that. But again, because I was a bit naughty, that fascination with language is something very strong in me, because I could never quite do it. And I've kind of taught myself over the years. So I'm always fascinated with words. So my point is that whenever I find a word that I like, I try and find out what it means. So I look in the dictionary and I look in the etymological dictionary to see where it comes from. The word interior is an amazing word when you look it up. The etymology, do you know this dictionary, the one that tells you the roots of words? The etymological definitions of the word interior, well, the name inter is Latin, and it means in between. I think it was Per talked about the in-between earlier. It also means among or during, which is quite a nice way of thinking about a time dimension to the interior as well, something that's during, enduring. And inter, as a word, became enter in Latin terms. And again, that's quite interesting for us. To enter something means quite clearly a shift from one state to another, one atmosphere to another, an outside, an inside, a condition, whatever you want to call it. And there's also another aspect to this word, which is inter, which actually means to bury something. So the point I'm making is the word itself has ambiguity driven through it. The vagueness of this word can go back even further. You can go back to Sanskrit with this word. Antar, a Sanskrit word, comes back to enter again. So again, even, it doesn't matter how far you go back with this word, you can see a certain kind of wonderful vagueness to it. It's only in the 19th century, and I think this may have been mentioned already, that and particularly with regards to the bourgeoisie home, that the word interior starts to represent inside space. And Suzie was talking earlier about the interior of Australia. Before, quite often in the 18th century, 17th, etc., the interior was used to define non-coastal regions of places without loading it with the colonial kind of angle that Suzie talked about, which is fascinating. Anyway, the point is this word interior encapsulates a wonderful ambiguity already in itself. This is nothing new. It still goes on today, I would argue. A lovely paper by Michael Guggenheim, very interesting, called The Formless Discourse, The Impossible Knowledge of Change of Use. I have to show this picture because I'm one of these slightly annoying people who, whenever I read anything now, I fill it with these wonderful little tags. My assistants, where I work, give me these little... They know that I love these little post-it things, but they've got a little arrow on them. And then anybody knows wherever I've ever been in a library or in somebody else's library or borrowed a book, because I tend to stick these things all over it where there's an interesting line or sentence. Guggenheim's very interesting, and he talks about, and this is just 4 years ago, talks about the language of change of use, which is an aspect of the interior I'll discuss later. But he talks about the struggle to fully represent the interior around language. And his view is that the language of change of use, in particular, doesn't codify its object, doesn't clarify its object, which, okay, I kind of not sure about that, but it's an interesting idea. He suggests that the interior requires a language that is very different to other spatially based practices. It needs one that captures its essences and vitalities. And he makes a suggestion, which I'll come to a bit later, which is actually quite interesting. I do agree with much of what he says, and I've tried to do some work on this myself around words, and I recently did a paper for a presentation in Indonesia which was called The Dialectic of the Interior, where I had a rather ham-fisted attempt at sort of trying to describe a language for the interior which may capture some of its essences. It struck me as I was talking about this stuff in this presentation that the dialectic for me of the interior, I use that quite specifically, was that rather than a dialectic where two opposites kind of supersede each other, i.e. the traditional notion of a dialectic, supersedence, one thing replaces another, the dialectic of the interior for me is different. And actually the dialectic is where two opposites are joined together to make what I call a composite construct. Something which is made from two polarities that can be quite different to make something new. I'll try and explain that a little bit more if that's getting a bit too epidemic. When we talk about the interior, I'm always struck, particularly when you talk to students, but also colleagues as well, we talk about this kind of amalgam, a composite of things, other ideas, building reuse if we're reusing a building, other theories, philosophies, etc., which we kind of can comfortably run through the interior, and it makes sense, normally, usually. And I realised that a lot of these conversations surrounded, were around kind of what I would call dualities, this polarity, this dialectic. Things which maybe are at odds with each other, but we put them together. So, for instance, some of the dualities or the dialectics I think that we use when we describe the interior, a classic one is space and place. Here I use the word, sorry about the long quote, but it's a really fascinating book by Alistair Bonnet, Unruly Places, Secret Cities and Other Inscrutable Geographies. And he talks about space and place. And I think Kees is maybe going to talk about space and place, I think, later. Bonnet rather nicely talks about the abstract quality of space and the very specific quality of place. And it struck me that, you know, one of the dialectics of the interior, possibly, or the interior language, is that we quite often talk about the interior in this way comfortably. It is a mixture of space and place. Another classic one, of course, is interior-exterior. We always talk about inside-outside space with regards to our interiors, and it's a kind of intrinsic language dialectic of what we talk about. And again, you know, we can talk about inter and enter, etc. and anta. And of course, the third one, the classic, old-new. Always talking about the relationship between old stuff and new stuff. And, you know, following, I suppose, from Venturi in many ways, this isn't an either-or dialectic. This is a both-and, but I would even go further than that and call it this notion of a composite construct. It's only through those opposites, the dialectic, put together, that the resonance for the interior begins. Old and new together creates something much more powerful and energetic and dynamic than old on its own or new on its own. So the dialectic was a kind of one of my attempts to look at the condition of the interior through language. There's many others, of course. I don't have time to go into them, but we can maybe have a fun game later in the pub trying to work them out. It's not a new idea. Like all of my ideas, I tend to pinch them from other people or places and make them my own, like a true adapter that I am. Charles Rice talked about the doubled interior, or the twofold room, an image and a place, particularly in relation to the bourgeoisie home. George Tayset talks about doubled space as well in his latest book, The Constellation of Everyday Objects, which is a lovely book. So it's not nothing new, it isn't anything new, but there's something in this, I think, that for me, one of the conditions is about these counterpoints, this composition of things brought together, sometimes under one roof, sometimes not, that has a resonance, an oscillation between themselves to give us the energy of the subject. This kind of leads me to my second condition, and I'm a bit more on familiar ground here. The second condition I'm going to talk about is reuse. I am somebody who's kind of obsessed slightly worryingly about building reuse. I can't kind of shake it off really, because I think ultimately I probably have a fear of the empty page. I like to work with things already around and make them into something new, turn them around. Much of my work, particularly in writing, has focused on this aspect of the interior, and it is just one aspect of many. But for me, it's an important one. I enjoy it. The reason is because I kind of come at the interior from a position where I feel that whether we are in an office making an interior where somebody gives you a line on a page and says, you know, do the interior of that, or whether we're working with an existing building that's crumbling, or a modern building that's out there, whatever it is, I feel that we are always kind of working with matter that exists. And it's the manipulation of that matter, the editing, the translating of it, which Suzie pointed to earlier, which is, for me, a key condition of us as interior people. I use the term interior people as well because in the UK, and maybe we can digress a little bit, in the UK, we have kind of given up with interior architecture, interior design, interior decoration, in that we don't even bother having the conversation anymore. And we don't care, actually, anymore. Sorry, I know these conversations can be quite precious and important to people. And I tell you why, because we've come to I feel anyway, myself and my colleagues, particularly in education, is that in a way, no matter what it is, we're kind of always dealing with some sort of existent matter. Whether you call yourself an interior architect, interior designer, interior decorator, doesn't really matter, actually. And I think interior decoration is by far the most interesting aspect of what we do anyway, which is still undernourished and not really explored. There's nuances, of course. I like the description where interior architecture is with building, interior design is free of architecture. That's what I like as a description, and you can play it like that if you want as a title. Over the years, this sketch, I should clarify that over the years, I've realised I've drawn this sketch probably 100 times for students on the back of a fag packet, on a napkin in a restaurant. Even once it was on the back of my hand once, as I was talking to somebody about it. And I suppose it's become a bit of a default position for me, really, a bit of a habit. But I like to show it because I feel that part of this language conversation is some of it we can get over quite quickly, I feel. Now, this notion of reuse is nothing new. Again, some of the finest artists in the 20th century and beyond have been reusers. Duchamp was a great interior designer, of course. And I like to think that actually installation artists generally quite often are our closest relatives in terms of creating spaces with stories. But as well as the past and people doing this, it is also a very, very contemporary phenomenon, the idea that we don't start with a blank page and that we re-edit and we rework, as Brücker said in post-production in 2010, which is still a seminal book, I feel. The notion of starting or creating meaning from virgin material is no longer really possible, Brücker suggests. I kind of agree with him. We can't invent anything new anymore, can we? Aren't we just re-editing what's there already to make it mean something else? When you relate that to buildings, of course, well, I was talking to a guy the other day in a conference in London who told me that he felt quite strongly that in the next 20 years we'll see the end of new build, which I thought was quite controversial, but I quite liked it. So it was quite an interesting idea. And so beyond then, we'll just be remixing our buildings. Reuse as a condition leads me to just a little outline of my first ever book, if you'll indulge me for a while. The book I wrote with Sally, my perennial co-author, we've done quite a few books together. Reuse for me is something, as I say, that's fundamental for me and part of my way of approaching the interior. I did this book now a decade ago. My God, it makes me feel old. That's 2004, so over a decade ago. And it really came about where Sally and I were teaching interiors in separate institutions, but came across the same response from our students. Where do we find out about this stuff? Who's writing about it? And I developed a set of lectures talking about it, which then became a kind of outline for a book. And Sally was doing the same thing at the same time in another institution. And when we went to see a publisher, the publisher said, somebody else has got an idea like this, and that's how we started working together. So I knew Sally before anyway, so it wasn't completely like we just bumped into each other. But anyway, the The book was called Rereadings, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about it with regards to reuse, because I think it can outline quite usefully this processual-based information that Guggenheim refers to as trying to find a language for the interior. I won't read this long quote from Giancarlo Di Carlo, but the title, Rereadings, is nicked from one of his quotes in true appropriation style. The book is very much about setting out a language of the interior, but also talking about a process. And it's very different, as Guggenheim and others have mentioned, we feel quite different to a kind of a new build approach, an approach that is about starting from scratch. The book was divided, if you don't know, it was divided into 3 areas, 4 chapters actually, but 3, the last one is sort of significant case studies. The first part is analysis, pretty normal. If you're working with existing buildings, I think Evelyn said it yesterday, you're working with existing buildings, your first port of call really is analysis. What is there? What are we dealing with? What does it give us? What are we going to need to do with this? And we suggested in analysis that we could look at history and function, what the previous use, form and structure, what's the building stand up, how's it stand up, what's it look like, etc. Context and environment, and the new function. And the analysis wasn't just a kind of pragmatic approach to the solid stuff of building. We also talked about memories, sounds, smells, stuff that's kind of not solid, or not always solid anyway. Stuff that allows you to bring in other ideas and other ways of thinking about reuse. The second part was strategy, and I'm going to come back to this. And the third part was tactics. So once you've analysed something, you can construct maybe an approach, a strategy, and then you realise those things through tactics. And the tactics of the interior, there's many of them, of course, but we were talking about the plane, wall, floor, ceiling, soffit, etc. Object, light, natural, artificial, surface, aperture, movement, all of these things which are very key to us as interior people, or people who make the interior. I'm just going to come back to strategy a bit, because for me that was the most innovative, I feel, aspect of the book. That was where I think we broke a bit of new ground, because up to that point we were really struggling to find strategies for the interior. Where were they? Who were doing them? Architecture, of course, had quite a few. There was the Plan Libre, or the Free Plan from Korb. There's a Round Plan from Loos, etc. More. We couldn't find any that were very particular to the interior. So we devised them really, where we feel that in reuse, these approaches to the interior were pretty much reliant on what was there, the existing building. And the 3 strategies that we kind of came up with, and these are broad brushstroke strategies, I should say, are based upon the sheer extent of the relationship or integration between the existing and the new stuff that's going in. So the strategies were intervention. We talked about the idea of intervening into a building. Now that sounds quite dramatic, and it is. To intervene, this is, by the way, some of these pictures are student works that I run projects called intervention, installation, insertion, so I picked out some student images as I was coming over. Intervention sounds quite dramatic, and it is. When you intervene into something, into anything, it's quite dramatic. It can involve cutting, it can involve demolition, it can involve something really quite brutal. The thing about intervening is that the resultant composite construct of new-old, let's say, is integrated. The new and the old are joined together. I tend to make these hand signals when I do this, but hopefully that can make sense. New and old are reliant on each other. They become co-joined. They're clearly distinguished, but they are cut together. They're reliant on each other. The second strategy or approach we would suggest is insertion. Insertion is when you decide after your analysis, or you can do it without analysing anything, because this strategy might just make sense, is when you can devise an autonomous object which you can put into, onto, around, extend, underneath the existing building. And the relationship between the two is semi-autonomous. The new object will often be built to fit, but it can be removed at a later point, but there is an integral relationship between the host and the new object. So this kind of model of the De Trust Theatre by Mekanu illustrates that. A wonderful kind of 3-storey piece of furniture gets dropped into the void of the existing church building. The third strategy and final one we suggest, the broad brushstroke for approaching this stuff, was installation. To install something gives the interior a temporal dimension. The old and the new here, are completely independent of each other. Installation, you can use it as a dramatic strategy. Sometimes it can be theatrical. Sometimes it can really heighten the existing building that you're dealing with. But it will always result in the relationship between the two being very separate. The installed interior can be removed without the building suffering, let's say. And, exhibitions, temporal things are quite often in this area, but you might also relate it to retail, which has quick turnover. It lasts maybe for a few years or months, or, pop-up stuff, of course, lasts for half an hour, etc., etc. So hopefully you can see that there's a kind of sliding scale of strategy, which I felt was the most innovative part of our book. This, for me, is a kind of the second condition of the interior, reuse. And it's something that I'm very close to and enjoy very much. And for me, it's fundamental, actually, to the subject. The third condition, and the final one for this part of the talk, is sort of, I just want to touch a bit on interior history, actually. And it's kind of related to reuse as well, so I'm kind of carrying on with that story. Now, if reuse is a fundamental aspect, working with extant matter, if you consider that as a fundamental aspect of the interior, I think that there's a source here for the ambiguity of the interior, or the unfixedness of the interior that I talked about earlier. Because if we accept that reuse is a big part of the interior, that really puts us at odds with 20th century history, modernity in particular. Modern history, particularly in architecture, is closed. We know the big names, there they all are, and it's a canon which is pretty much boxed off. Rarely did the kind of big names of 20th century architecture remodel or rework existing buildings, with a few notable exceptions. The Bestugay apartment by Korb, I think it's his best project, but nobody else does in his history books. The American bar by Löve in Vienna is, I think, probably one of the real classic interiors of the 20th century. It's one of my favourite spaces. But generally, the big names of 20th century history in architecture anyway didn't really rework with existing buildings, and there may be a number of reasons for that, which I haven't got massive time to go into. But there's one reason that I do want to sort of explore with you, and that is function. Function and modernity is they're very closely related, of course. Form follows function, etc., etc. And a functionalist approach to design is a central tenet of modern architecture. If reuse is a central element of the interior, as I'm suggesting, then the notion that buildings retain their function is problematic for us, because they don't. We know they don't. We know buildings, as Fred says here very eloquently, we know buildings become derelict. They lose their use. Function slips away. People abandon buildings because they no longer work or fit for purpose, or they have to because of war or whatever reason, but function drifts away. And that's really where we start our processes, really. We start with the building as, maybe you can describe it as valueless, but redundant, obsolete. Function has drifted away. And this is where buildings become waste. Another thing I've been interested in recently, and we can talk maybe at length about the commodification of waste and of buildings as well, how buildings become commodities because they are out of use, and they, in a circular economy, their value has kind of have to be rechanged, etc., etc., etc. But anyway, that's another story. And of course, you know, if we really wanted to get into it, we can really go down the sustainable route and recycling, upcycling, salvage, etc., of course. And there's, my sort of stock sort of response to this area is that absolutely fine, and not a great interest of mine, but what is interesting is the kind of sociology of waste, really, particularly in the built environment. I'm fascinated by these Dutch guys, Superuse, who talk about